Hi, everyone. It's so good to kind of see you. It's good to be with you here today, knowing that you're listening, although I can't see your lovely faces. My name is H.M. Humphrey. I am a licensed clinical mental health counselor, a part of the Mood Treatment Center practice. And I've been asked today to give a webinar, a little talk about couples in quarantine. And my hope with this talk is that you will really walk away with a sense of how you might reach to your partner and strengthen your connection in the midst of all this crazy time that we're going through. This talk is really designed for couples, for romantic partners, but you may actually find that it could be insightful for other types of relationships as well. And that might include friendships or family relationships. A lot of these themes are kind of similar and run the gamut of different types of relationships. So even if you are not in a partnership yourself, you may find that some of these themes are useful for you. So in terms of how to access questions and answers throughout this PowerPoint presentation, you'll see that there will be time for question and answering halfway through, and then once more at the end of the presentation. So you can feel free to send in any of your questions throughout the talk, just as they come up, but I'll answer them halfway through and then again at the end. If you'd like to submit a question on your desktop, you can click the questions button in the bottom right-hand side of the menu box. And if you want to submit a question on your phone, you can click the question mark at the bottom of the app. And also in the app, you can swipe back and forth if you want to toggle between the video and the slides. So let's dive right in. So why a talk about relationships in the time of COVID-19? I think it's pretty intuitive, really, but in the midst of crisis, what often happens is our relationship insecurities tend to get louder, and our raw spots just might feel more irritated or sensitive. And we really need to feel comforted when we're under that strain. It's really normal and it's really understandable. You might have noticed that you feel a bit more sensitive towards your partner or your family member or your friend. If you are someone who works with clients, you might have sort of noticed that they may be expressing more sensitivity within the context of their relationships. And again, very normal, very understandable. So what do I mean by relationship insecurities? It could really include a lot of different things, but you might think about that in terms of general worry that you might have about your relationship. It could be a kind of sadness that you might feel about your relationship, helplessness, stuckness, could be a kind of loneliness. There may have been things that you've experienced in the context of your relationship. It might be like injuries, old injuries that might have happened that maybe feel a bit more inflamed or raw because of the time that we're in. So we tend to handle relationship insecurities in different ways. First of all, some people tend to go quiet and withdraw and really kind of come into themselves and internalize. For people who tend to withdraw, they may be not very expressive about how they're feeling. They may appear kind of blank or kind of detached. And then secondly, some people become very verbal and expressive, kind of the opposite actually, right? They're really sort of seeking engagement. And these people might be more likely in the relationship to say, hey, we need to talk about us, especially when things are feeling sort of heavy or emotional between you. So you might just take a second here to think about, how do you tend to handle difficulties in your relationship? You might also think about, how does your partner tend to handle difficulties in the relationship. It's very common to see one of each type in a couple. There can be some variation on this, right? Like that you might have thought to yourself, well, I kind of withdraw, but my partner also kind of withdraws. There can be a little variation on it, right? But there tends to be one partner who's a little bit more likely to say, we need to talk about us. And then there tends to be one partner who's a little bit more likely to say, no, I don't want to go there. I don't feel that I can. So a tip would be sort of a piece of advice in a way would be that, whether you're going quiet or withdrawing or turning up the volume and pursuing, this is most likely your best attempt at regulating your relationship insecurities, right? Shutting down, going quiet, or turning up the volume and pursuing and insisting or demanding a conversation. It might actually be your self-protection, right? It may be the thing that you do in order to try and regulate all of that distress that you may be feeling on the inside, all the wobbliness that you might be feeling on the inside. So it's very understandable that we may take that kind of action at times. Unfortunately, and you might have noticed this before, these tendencies can really get us stuck into a back and forth pattern of unresolved relational distress. If you are someone who tends to shut down and go quiet and disengage, you might have noticed that that could be quite triggering for your partner. And in fact, your partner may have the tendency of turning the volume up even louder and getting angry when you do that thing that you do to try and cope. And of course, on the other side of that coin, if you are someone who tends to turn the volume up and become very expressive, pushing for some kind of contact or conversation, you might notice that the more you sort of express how you're feeling, the more your partner tends to go quiet or just disengage in some way. So again, you can see how we might get stuck in a back and forth pattern of unresolved relational distress because you're triggering each other. So when we are operating in our self-protection mode, we do not always see how we are impacting our partner on the inside. And we do not always see how we are triggering their underlying relationship insecurities. When your partner gets triggered, they most likely employ their own form of self-protection, which might in turn trigger you, as we were just sort of talking about. And this is how a negative cycle of interaction might get born. So this negative cycle of interaction, another way of thinking about it is like an unhelpful pattern or even a kind of dysfunctional little dance that we might do at times with our partner when we're feeling a lot of distress, a lot of heaviness on our relationship. It's really the way that we tend to get stuck in difficult conversations, right? It's sort of the how. It's how we get stuck in difficult conversations. And the tragic part is that it can leave us feeling disconnected, really angry. It can make you feel that you are just a million miles apart from the person that you really care about, really distant. So now we're going to have just a little bit of time here for any initial questions that might be coming up for you. So the first question is, what about when both partners withdraw and we get stuck in inaction? And that's a really good question, right? To that point, right, you're really asking and catching on that there's not always, it's not always a super clear cycle of withdraw, pursue, right? Even a pursuer might end up kind of backing off and saying, oh, maybe I won't try and get too close because it goes badly if I do, or I don't want to be disappointed if I do. So that does happen, absolutely, where we may end up stuck in withdrawal on both sides. And it is, it's really difficult, right? It can be really difficult to know how to change that or what to do with it. And it can be really discouraging. So I think that as we continue on, there may be some answers might come up for you as we are continuing on with the talk. Because really, if you can just begin to recognize what it is that's going on for you, the more you can slow it down and slice it just a little bit thinner, the more you can start to communicate that to your partner. So right now, I might just encourage you to hold it in mind that, oh, okay, it's possible that I withdraw and also my partner withdraws. So just hold that in mind and see if you can kind of sit with that, and maybe more will come up for you as we continue on. The second question is how might we explain this cycle to our partner? I love that you are asking that question, and we will go on to talk about that a little bit more closely as well. The next question is, how does an expressive person connect with someone who withdraws? That's a great, great question. And the sort of the heart of it is really making it safer, right? So we can assume that if someone is withdrawing or shutting down, there is, again, that relationship insecurity or distress is getting really triggered, even if you don't see it on the outside. Right? When your partner is in withdrawal, shutdown mode, it may not look like they're bothered at all. But we have this assumption that actually there's something going on that would lead them to shut down. And so what we really need is a lot more safety, a lot more emotional safety. And again, I think that will become a little bit more clear as we continue on with the talk. But part of it might be softening your anger a bit. Like if you find that you're an expressive person and you're struggling to get through, you might find that you do become somewhat harsh or critical. You turn up the volume in order to get a point across. And if you can be conscious of that and just be really curious about, okay, and take responsibility, right? This is how I'm reacting. But now I'm going to be really curious about what might be going on the inside for my partner. And I'm going to try and be sort of neutral or non judgmental about it. It just creates an overarching sort of atmosphere of safety. And it's much easier to have real conversations from that place. And the last question here is, what about when my boyfriend doesn't take my advice sometimes on things I know will benefit us? And I would say to that, the person who's asking this question might really identify more so as a pursuing partner, right? That it may be your tendency sometimes to take advice on things that you know will benefit your relationship because there's like a hope that you might be stronger as a couple, more connected as a couple. And that makes it makes so much sense, right? And again, as I've been sort of speaking to the other questions, there may be something on the inside that is getting stirred up or triggered for him, some type of uncertainty or discomfort. And it's maybe not just about you, but maybe about himself as well. And so the advice is really to try and slow it down, slice it thinner, take responsibility for what it is that you do in the way that you get triggered, and also become really curious about what might be happening for your partner on the inside that would lead him to kind of not take your advice or hold out or stonewall a bit. Great questions. Thank you so much. We're going to move on here and we'll have more time for questions at the end. So this would not be a complete talk about relationships if we didn't talk about anger, right? Of course, anger, because right when we get stuck in our cycles, we often end up fighting a lot more. So it's important to know that there's actually different types of anger. So a withdrawing anger is kind of anger that's like, leave me alone. Like, I now want to talk about this thing. I don't want to engage with you in this capacity or in this way. It's really a kind of like an anger to get something to shut down. So this can also resemble numbness or showing very little emotional reaction, right? You may have noticed that sometimes, especially in us withdrawers, our anger might look like silence, stony, cold silence, right? Just trying to get something to shut down. And then, of course, there's also a protesting anger, which is basically saying, I'm not okay with how the things are between us. And I'll give you an example, a metaphor that might be useful in sort of drawing this out and making this a little bit more vivid for you. You can imagine that a group of protesters is standing on the sidewalk outside of an institution, and they have their signs and they have their loudspeakers, and they're ready to fight. Basically, they're willing to turn up the volume and throw verbal daggers and be really critical, all because they have a hope that something will change, right? They're probably out there with some kind of value that they really believe that an injustice is occurring and something needs to be different. And so they're willing to go out there and really turn up the volume and protest. You can hear there's a kind of hope in there, right? That's kind of the sweet message in that anger. And you can imagine, for some of you, you might think, oh, that sounds like my partner, right? That sounds like someone I know. So a tip for you would be that it can be really very powerful for you to say to someone in protesting anger, I want to hear every single thing that you have to say. I do. I want to listen. I want to know what you have to say. You can imagine that if that group of protesters is on the street protesting, demonstrating, it would be so wild if the CEO were to come out of that institution and very calmly say, I'm here, I'm engaged, I do want to hear every single thing that you have to say. Can you put down the loudspeaker? You don't have to yell anymore. You might still be angry, but you don't have to shout at me. I do want to listen. I do want to know what you have to say. We calm down when we feel heard. It's just a human thing, right? We calm down when we feel heard. So you might hold that in mind if you are thinking of someone now who has been very expressive and has expressed that anger to you very clearly. The challenge for all relationships is that anger is really a masking emotion. It almost always covers up something more vulnerable below. Just like that relationship distress or insecurity that we were talking about at the very start. And remember, that might be like a fear or an uncertainty or a concern. It could be sadness or loneliness. It could be an old injury, right? That relationship insecurity, if there's anger coming up, that it so often happens that it's really covering up something more vulnerable underneath. I will give you another metaphor, believe in the power of metaphor, to try and make this one a little bit more vivid for you as well. So you might imagine that you are driving down the road, minding your own business, when another car comes in front of you and you are forced to slam on your brakes in order to avoid narrowly missing that car. I know you can't respond to me now, but you might just think for yourself for a second, what do you feel? What comes up for you in that scenario? For me personally, rage, right? Anger, fury. I'm like so mad that that guy almost cut me off. It really, really makes me angry. And now you might consider, right before that anger came up, what was it that you felt? And for me, panic, right? Panic, fear. I'm terrified that I'm going to die or something very bad is about to happen. It's a really panicky feeling. So you can see that that can change in a split second, right? Sometimes we're not even clearly aware that our the anger that might be getting triggered in us is actually really about a deeper sense of fear or panic, for example. So the truth of that experience, the heart of that experience is really about that fear and about that panic, right? So like if I'm later on, if I'm talking to my mom and I'm telling her this crazy thing happened and I almost got in a car accident, I could tell her I was so angry at that driver. And that would be the story, but it would only be part of the story, right? It would be much more vivid and truthful and communicative for her if I were to say, I was so angry, but really, underneath that anger, I was terrified. I was really frightened. And in that case, she might be able to kind of comfort me, right? Like, that would be scary, and I'm so glad you're okay. So you can see that this is a bit, it links to our communication, really. You can imagine that this could be translated somehow into your conversations with your partner, that if you are getting really activated, really angry, it's so helpful for you to be able to say, I did get really angry with you, or I did get really defensive. And the reason is actually because I had all this fear or sadness that was coming up underneath. You need to know that that's what was going on. So again, another tip would be to try to always assume that if you or your partner is angry, there is generally something more vulnerable triggered underneath. That could be helplessness, stuckness, shame, yucky feeling. So the encouragement is to try to be really curious and non-judgmental about what they might be experiencing besides the anger that they are showing you. And of course, it's not just about understanding your partner better, but it's also about understanding yourself a bit better as well, right? Slowing it down and slicing it just a little bit thinner. So I wonder, if you actually might have a sense of what your own most common relationship insecurities might be, right? These are kind of the familiar concerns or fears that often resurface for yourself or for about yourself or about your partner or your relationship. You probably have noticed some patterns in your own life that, right? The thing that freaks me out about this relationship is kind of the same thing that freaked me out about my last one. It might even remind you of insecurities that you might have felt in your own family of origin, right? Towards your siblings or your parents or something. It tends to be kind of a pattern that comes up across the board in relationships. So I'm going to take us through an exercise here, which is really meant to try and help you expand your awareness and kind of fine tune your knowledge, your awareness, your insight into what might happen for you on your side of the negative cycle when you are getting caught in distress. So these questions are really meant to help you think about, how does it go for me when things are hot and heavy between me and my partner, not in a good way, right? Like, how does it go for me when things are hard between us, when things are difficult and painful? So my first question is, I'm just going to kind of go through these gradually with you, and I encourage you to think as I'm asking you, what would be a trigger for you when it comes to your relationship? What would be a trigger for you? And, sometimes it's really, really small. It may not even be something that your partner says. It could be, but it could be really much smaller than that, right? It could be like a certain look on his or her face. It could be like a weird silence. It may be that your partner has a certain, I don't know, like kind of body tension that you can feel it and you're like, oh, I don't know about that. Maybe that they're on their phone a lot. right? There could be lots of little cues. And when you have that thing in mind, that cue in mind, I'm going to encourage you just to notice what it is that you feel in your body or that you sense in your body. There may be a kind of tension or restriction, some kind of activation that starts to bubble up for you inside your own body. The next question is, when you see that cue or that trigger, how do you interpret that? Right? What's the kind of thought that you have that goes through your mind when you see your partner doing that thing? Sometimes it's a very quick automatic assumption. It's often negative. It may also be a thought about yourself, right? Like, uh-oh, I did something bad. Or, uh-oh, maybe I'm being too forceful. I'm being too much or too needy. The next question is, can you sense what that underlying vulnerable emotion might be that's getting triggered when you see that cue? So again, it could be one of those relationship insecurities that we've already been talking about, right? It could be fear, it could be some kind of loneliness or helplessness, it could be an inadequacy thing. The next question is, what's the emotion that your partner most clearly sees in a fight or in a really heavy moment? So fighting looks really different between partners, right? Sometimes some of us are very verbal and much more sort of knock down, drag out, the neighbors can hear kind of deal. But sometimes it's very subtle and very quiet and very tense. Depending on how you are in your relationship, you might just think about this question, right? Like, what is the thing that your partner most clearly sees when you are really riled up? That could be anger. It could also be a kind of numbness, right? It could also be kind of like a blankness, like, I don't really feel anything. Like, I kind of go into shutdown mode. And then the final question is, when all of this is online for you, when all of this cascade is happening for you, what do you feel the urge to do? What is the behavior, the thing that you just feel the urge to do? So that might be you feel the urge to stop talking, disengage, avoid this conversation, hide until the storm passes. It could also be that you really feel the urge to turn the volume up or to say it in a different way or to push for a conversation. It might be that you feel the urge to like become critical, that it's like, well, now I really feel like I need to point out all the things that you are doing. Kind of defensiveness, right? So I will walk through you with this and I'll give you just examples for myself. It may be helpful to kind of flesh it out for you a little bit. So going back to the top of this pattern here, the cue, right? Again, sometimes it's super small. In my case, my partner will, for me, when he gets a serious look on his face and he does this sniff, he goes, there's just something about that. It really triggers my whole pattern, my whole side of the cycle. It's so ridiculous. It's really tiny, right? But it's the serious look and that sniff. And the thing that I notice in my body, it's some kind of discomfort in my chest. Like this happens really quickly, right? I'm really slowing it down here. All of this happens in a moment. But I hear the sniff, I feel that discomfort in my chest. It's an uncomfortable feeling. And then the cognition that I have, right? The thought or the interpretation that I tend to make out of that. It's really quick, it's automatic, but it's usually like, uh-oh, he's mad at me, or he's annoyed with me. And I often have a similar thought of, I must have messed up again, right? Like there's probably something that I did that I'm not even aware of. And that's what that sniff brings up in me. The vulnerable emotion, I mean, I think you can kind of hear it, right? It's like it's fear. It's fear that I might have messed up. And I would really say that's like an inadequacy thing. It's kind of a shame. It's in the shame family. Like it's a yucky feeling. I hate that feeling. Some of you might resonate with that, right? It's like a fear of having disappointed him, a fear of not doing a good enough job, and not even necessarily really knowing that I've messed up. And of course, the masking emotion, like I get pissed, right? Like I get really angry, I get mad, I get defensive. Um, like it can get ugly, right? Like it can come out with irritability that can really grow into anger. And I really feel the urge, my action tendency here, I really feel the urge to just like defend myself right off the bat, or to ultimately to like shut down or dodge the whole conversation, right? It's like I don't want to go there. I already don't feel like I'm doing a good job. And I really don't feel like if we go here now, that I'm going to do a good enough, like I'm going to make it worse, right? It's a feeling, it's a sense of helplessness, and I'm going to make it worse. And so shutdown mode is partly about me preserving myself and not feeling the yucky feelings, but it's also about the relationship, right? Like if I can just shut down, maybe this thunderstorm will blow over and I'll emerge when the sun's back out and we'll be good again. So that's a little bit of what I mean by slowing it down and slicing it thinner, right? And you might be able to kind of sense for yourself that, oh, right, like there is a thing that happens for me. This is the way that I get stuck when we are in a heavy spot. You know, you might have really realized that whatever your action tendency is, right? Like you may not be like me, you may not be so much a withdrawer. You might really feel the urge to um, protest, right? Or turn the volume up, or become harsh or critical, or like push for conversation. And either way, you can see that that may trigger something in your partner, right? It may trigger something in your partner and it may connect to their whole part of the pattern. And that can keep you locked in a cycle. So for you to have just a little bit of an increased awareness about this, it's a big deal because it can seem really chaotic when you're stuck in your cycle. But there is a kind of logic or order that comes up for us, right? Even our emotion, as like crazy as it can seem sometimes, there's a kind of a pattern or a logic that happens, and it just really helps to be able to put it into more clear terms like that. So another piece of advice would be, you know, when we can really communicate in an honest way about how it is that we get triggered and, you know, honestly, the things that we do to handle it, that can be so helpful for improving our communication with our partner. I would encourage you to only share this with your partner if you can do so in a way that really reveals information about yourself, in a way that reveals vulnerable information about yourself, right? This is not a time to be pointing out your partner's unhelpful behavior because you're trying to make it safer, right? Like you're trying to create emotional safety so that your partner isn't so on guard. And I'll try and give you an example of this too, right? So in my relationship, it's really been very helpful when I've been able to say, look, when you get that serious look on your face and you do that sniff that you do, I get, it all happens rapid fire, but I get this queasy feeling in my chest. And I get immediately, I have this thought. I'm like, I must have done something wrong. He's annoyed with me. And all this like concern, discomfort, even honestly, even fear, anxiety, it starts to come up. And the fear is that I have messed up, that I've disappointed you somehow. And really, it just triggers all my inadequacy stuff, which was there before he ever came along, by the way. And for me to say all of that gets triggered, and that's when I get irritable and defensive. And that's when I shut down. My husband says, "You wilt like a flower. You go quiet and you wilt like a flower." And so when I can say, I know that I do, I do wilt like a flower. And the reason is because all of this yucky inadequacy and just fear of disappointing you, it comes online, even with something as small as a sniff. So my way of coping with that is I go quiet, I withdraw. I'm really just hoping that thunderstorm will blow over. I don't want to make it worse. I want to preserve the connection that we have. So you can imagine that it really creates a lot of safety because I'm not just over here saying, you scare me, right? I'm not just saying, you're always criticizing me and I'm always scared that I'll let you down. Like you're always telling me I'm not good enough, right? And if I come at it in that way, that's putting all the blame on him and he's immediately on edge. But if I can say, this is honestly what happens for me, and this is how I've been handling it, and I think it probably impacts you, and maybe we get stuck in a pattern around this. There's that message of like I can see it and I want it to be different. You know, it's not that I'm shutting down because I don't care. It's actually I care very much, and this is what I do to cope. So you know that sweet message. Maybe you can kind of feel that in yourselves, right? That like there may be a sense of longing for connection and trust with your partner. I don't know why it is, but it's just a human thing that when the times that we struggle the most in our relationships is really the times when things feel uncertain or wobbly or we feel like we're on shaky ground. So in a very almost like curious way, there's really a sweet message tucked away in there, right? That like I worry so much about not being enough for my partner because I want to be enough. Like it matters to me. If he didn't matter to me, I wouldn't worry about not being enough. I'd just be indifferent, right? And for some of you who may identify more so as a protester or a pursuer, there's a sweet message for you as well, right? That like sometimes you may feel quite anxious about your relationship. You might feel quite bothered by your partner's disengagement. And the sweetness in that is that it's like you love this person and you're really hungry to feel secure and comfortable in your connection. So, another tip would be to try to directly communicate your love and your desire to be close with your partner. You can do this by focusing on recalling and sharing memories in which you did feel close and secure and connected. Like that can really go a long way just to let your partner know. There are good times that we've shared together, and I'm thinking about those times. In my mind, it's not all bad. You know, the negative doesn't override the positive. These are the times that I love that really bring me to life. And if I'm seeming off, it's maybe because I don't feel that we're sharing that right now, and I'm really hungry to get back to it. So we have another break here for final questions and answers. See if any more have come in. So one of you asked, my fiance often needs to withdraw to process emotions, which I've learned to accept even though I'm a pursuer. Good job. That's hard work. I can handle the lack of conversation, but the withdrawal of bodily affection is extra hurtful. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is really hurtful, isn't it? It's really quite painful. It really does hurt. So you need to be able to express that, right? You need to be able to express if something is hurting in your relationship, and it's part of a healthy relationship. Um, and I hope that in our conversation here today, you might have maybe gained just a little bit more clarity or insight or idea about how it is that you can communicate that hurt in like a soft way, right? And so part of it, part of how you make it softer is to hold this awareness that your fiance is withdrawing for a reason, right? That there's probably good reason for why he or she is withdrawing. Maybe it is to process emotion. Maybe they're like getting actually legitimately overwhelmed in those moments or feeling helpless or like their own kind of alarm bells are going off, right? So for you to be able to recognize that and to say, yeah, I understand, at least on the surface, that you're withdrawing because you need space to process something. And I'd really like to understand more. You know, I'm not assuming that I know everything about what happens on the inside for you, but I think it is about you, maybe not even so much about me. But what happens is when you do pull away, I have this automatic thought that says, he doesn't love me, he doesn't want to be close to me, or whatever it might be. So you create safety by saying, I assume that you have good reason for why you're pulling away, and I assume that it may actually be out of concern for our relationship. That just, it gives your partner the um, kind of the environment in which he or she can like explore that a little bit more, you know, and maybe there's a ways for you to come together around that. So another question would be kind of similar, right? But how do you find a middle ground when one of us is withdrawing anger and another is protesting anger? Yeah, it's a really good question. And you might have picked up some ideas like in this conversation so far. But a middle ground is really to try and build a greater awareness of the fact that you get stuck in a cycle, right? That you are both doing things in your pattern and your part of the dance that lead and contribute to a cycle. That's actually the real culprit here, right? It's more that the cycle is the problem in your relationship and probably less about you two as people. You're not enemies, right? You are not enemies. So the cycle helps us to understand how it is that you can get so stuck and can actually feel like enemies sometimes. So I would encourage you in terms of finding a middle ground, I would encourage you to just try and maybe share some of the things that you've been learning about this concept of a cycle, that all couples get stuck in a pattern where you boom, 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 accidentally trigger those underlying insecurities and then make a move to try and cope. And if you can sort of draw that out as like an external, it's almost like a third part of your relationship, right? Maybe you can come together if you can use some of that externalizing language and then talk about what's happening for me. Maybe each one of you can say what's happening for me when this cycle's going on, and how can we reach out to each other for help when all of our insecurity is getting triggered? Can we actually just talk to each other about that insecurity, that primary fear? So an example of this would be for me to say to my husband, I get triggered, I get scared that I'm not enough for you, and that's when I shut down and withdraw in anger. What I realized I really need is that I just really need to know from you that I am enough for you. Like, even if I don't get it right all the time, I need to know that in your eyes, like, actually, I am enough. Like, that's really the thing that I need help with. And he's really the only one who can comfort that for me. So the next question is, what do you do when your partner appears to need the exact opposite of what I need to feel emotionally safe? That's another really good question. And sometimes that's quite tricky, and we can have cycles that spring up around this. It's like, I need something to feel safe, but it might actually be triggering your partner. Again, if you can have a greater awareness about these different things, right? Like the pattern, the how, the way that you get stuck, the way that you get triggered. If you can talk about this with your partner, you may be able to kind of discover some new things about what's really going on when you're getting stuck. It's okay that you need different things, right? Like the goal is not for perfection. You know, like it takes a long time to kind of figure this stuff out, actually. And you're not going for perfection. It's okay to have fights, it's okay to have speed bumps. It's really more so about how do you come back together at the end, right? How do you come back together, identify your underlying need, and request that? And if your partner doesn't seem able to respond to that, then the question is, oh, what's making it hard? What's the block that gets in the way of you comforting me or helping me in the way that I need? And then you can try and talk that through as well. The next question is, how do you express to a withdrawer that you are here for them and want to be supportive, but also need to feel heard? Yeah, you know, that can be a hard spot to be in. I think, first of all, not blaming them for being a withdrawer. Right? It's so easy to do that. It's so easy to become critical or blame that your withdrawing partner is doing what they're doing because it's so hurtful, right? But if you can say to them, I'm starting to understand that really you withdraw for a reason, it's probably not just because you're trying to hurt me, that there's really something going on for you on the inside. And I really care about that. It's like my number one hope that I can comfort you and be a support to you in those things. I don't see it as weakness. That creates a lot of safety, and it will also make it more possible for your partner to hear you, right? When you can create safety like that, it makes it more possible for your withdrawing partner to be engaged and to hear you. And you may actually ask them that question, right? You might say, I think that we get caught in a cycle, and I think that that you withdraw because you're feeling overwhelmed, or at least I assume there's something maybe much, much deeper than that goes on for you. But I'm not blaming you. I think it probably makes sense that that happens. And also, what would help you to be a little bit more present or engaged? Like sometimes it seems like you have a really hard time hearing me and supporting me. So what would help you to be with me? Because I assume that you love me. I know you love me. I know you want to be here with me. So is there something I'm doing that's not helpful? And they may be actually able to speak to that. The next question is, how do you suggest handling a husband who is perfectly content the way things are, and after multiple conversations, they don't seem to want to break their cycle? Yeah, man, I just hear so much like frustration and probably like sadness in that question. That's so understandable. And I'm assuming that your husband is probably more on the withdrawing side. So again, how do I suggest handling a husband who's perfectly content the way things are and haven't responded to multiple conversations? I assume, again, try to hold this assumption that your partner is probably not perfectly content. It might look that way on the outside, and I do not know how it is that we can look completely content and calm on the outside, but on the inside is a tornado, right? On the inside, it may be extremely different than what you are seeing on the surface. So my strong encouragement to you is to try and hold that frame and just be really curious about how that might be true, even if it's hard for you to believe it right now. So for you to hold that frame that on the inside is probably more like a thunderstorm, even though on the outside it seems like he's content and not motivated to change. And you can try and communicate that, right? And it like in as gentle of a way as possible. I know that's so hard. Like it would be so easy to become critical and like anxious as you're trying to say this to your frozen partner. But if you can say, on the outside, you look so calm, but I have realized that probably on the inside, it's more like a thunderstorm. Like you may feel not regulated at all when I'm doing whatever it is that you do, right? You might come to him, you might turn up the volume, you might push for conversation. Sometimes you might honestly even take your daggers out in order to try and get some kind of response. Again, think about that group of protesters on the street, right? They might be willing to say awful things that they would normally never say to anyone else in a strong hope, just in a hope that something can be different or change. So if you are doing that, if that is your tendency when you're stuck in the cycle, if you can acknowledge that, that could go a long way for creating safety. But you make it safe. And the other thing is it can take a lot of time and space for a withdrawing person to kind of come around, right? Like it's not only because they're avoidant, but it might also be that sometimes for a withdrawer, his or her mind like actually goes blank. Like they literally are not able to sort of think very clearly about what they're experiencing. It may also be that when we're in shutdown or withdrawal mode, sometimes we actually feel numb. Like I've talked about this a little bit in this talk, that sometimes withdrawing anger, it can look like anger, but it can also be a kind of numbness. That can be a masking emotion as well. It's tricky because it's almost like feeling nothing, but it is a feeling. So we need a lot of time to just begin to think, oh, maybe there is something else going on for me, right? It may actually be partly your partner's not very aware of what's happening. So you can continue to suggest things, right? Maybe you suggest to your partner that you go to couples counseling or that you find a therapist or talk to someone, right? And they might be really on edge about that. That could be like that. That's maybe something you've tried before, and it's something that I think protesters or pursuers can kind of get caught in, right? Of like, well, let me give you another suggestion of what you might do to try and figure this stuff out so we can be better. So he might be resistant to it, but that's why it's so important for you to continue to try to create that safety. And again, the way you create that safety is by saying, I'm going to take ownership of what it is that I do. I'm going to take ownership, and I'm going to just try to be really curious and patient about what might be going on for you on the inside. I do want to hear, I know you need space. And so take your time, but let's see if we can connect in a kind of different way. And the last question here is, my partner has high functioning Asperger's and can talk all day long about me seeing myself, but isn't really able to take any information and apply it to himself. Can this awareness and practice itself help my marriage if my partner is not aware of the cycle and only willing to talk about my parts? Can I still make a positive impact on my marriage? That's a good question. Yeah. I think that the answer is yes. Your husband may be a little bit more able to notice sensations in his body. Like he might be able to say, when we're fighting, this is how my body feels. There may be some awareness on that level, and that's really useful. So sometimes I might ask myself or another person, so you're telling me you get that tightness in your chest. If that tightness had a voice, what would that voice say? In my case, the tightness would say, uh-oh, danger, right? I've annoyed my partner. Even that, like I don't know the situation with your partner, that may not be super possible, but it might be worth a try. Trying to sort of like making it a little bit more concrete, making that abstract experience a little bit more concrete. And I do think that your awareness about how it goes for you in your cycle is still useful, even if it's kind of one-sided, right? Because it helps, again, it really helps us to slow down, slice it thinner, take ownership of the things that we do, and also maintaining a curiosity about what could be happening on the inside for our partner. It's also possible that even the Asperger's itself, I don't know if you ever feel like it might at times become almost like a label, or that sometimes your partner might get quite discouraged if he's thinking about that Asperger's, or she is thinking about that Asperger's, but it may just be worth externalizing that a little bit as well, right? Like in some ways, if you can talk about it, and maybe you already do this in your relationship, but if you can talk about the Asperger's as like, it's me and you and the Asperger's, and sometimes this is the way that it can be a little bit of a block. You might be able to have some conversation around that, right? So even just to be able to have this recognition that like there's certain limitations or certain implications of having Asperger's, and when I encounter those, I tend to kind of shut down or withdraw, or I just kind of go blank and I don't really engage. Even to be able to make that explicit and to talk about it in that zoomed out kind of way could be a very useful conversation in your relationship. But for more sort of specialized knowledge around that, I think, undoubtedly meeting with somebody who does specialize in that kind of work and that kind of that just the arena of Asperger's might be useful for you as well. So we're at the end of our time here, and I just want to give you one more piece of information. Thank you so much for those questions, by the way. Those are really insightful and really helpful questions. We have one more webinar in this series. It is this Friday, the 22nd at 11:30 a.m., and it is about managing stress through spirituality. You can sign up for that webinar at moodtreatmentcenter.com/webinars. I also believe that all of our webinars have been recorded and are going to be uploaded onto YouTube for viewing later on if they haven't been already. So you can go back and replay this talk at any point if you are wanting to kind of run through it again or soak inside of it again. So thank you very much for your time and for your attention, and we hope to see you again soon. Take care.